Great. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second of a series of webinars that's being organized by the Global Counselling Psychology Forum. Let me just share my screen, which I did 5 minutes ago, and now okay, so I hope you are all able to see that.
No, Charles, no.
Not yet. You know what? I have to click share. Okay.
Now it's available, yeah.
Great. So everyone can see that.
The slides
Super.
haven't
Charles, we can't see your slides just yet. We can see your screen slides.
Okay, let me do it again.
There we go. It's up.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's really good to see you all. I see we've got 19 people in the room. And so a very warm welcome to the second webinar of Series 2 of the Global Counselling Psychology Forum. My name is Charles Young, and it's my honor to chair the session this afternoon, or this morning for some of you. I'm in Perth in Australia, and I know that there are people from the UK, South Africa, Australia, India, and I'm sure some other places that we'll hear about in a moment. So the title of this webinar is The State of the Profession and Developments Across the World, and we're going to hear from people who represent different countries. And so the agenda, there are really 4 parts. We are going to talk about, some of you may have seen, in fact, on social media over the past couple of weeks, the position paper that has been well received, and Chloe Donahue, who led the writing of that paper, is going to talk to that in a moment. Then we're going to have local presentations. We have representatives from Australia, India, Ireland, South Africa, and the UK. I'm not sure about the US. Then there'll be some time for a panel discussion and an opportunity for questions and answers, and then we will bring things to a close. I'll let individual kind of presenters introduce themselves as they go. But I thought maybe very quickly just to acknowledge Yutunda, who is the person who brought this forum together. And Yutunda is here, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from her over the course of this evening or morning, depending where you are. So to get started, Chloe, I'll let you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it. Maybe a thumbs up. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I am Chloe Donahue, and I've been leading on the position paper with the Global Counselling Psychology Forum. It's a project that we started working on about 1.5 years ago, and we've been working on quite closely as a forum together. So we're quite excited to be sharing it with everyone. All I'm going to do over the next few minutes is just walk you through a little bit about some of the uses that we might have for the position paper, and then also give a brief overview as to the contents of the paper. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about, which we discuss in our introduction, is just what the position paper is, and as well as some of what it can be used for. So it is an evidence-based document that looks at the varying aspects of counseling psychology, and it was designed to inform, educate, and promote a deeper understanding of counseling psychology around the globe. Now, there's so many different ways that this can be used, and this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, but we've thought about how it could be used for professionals within the field. So, for example, if you're a counseling psychologist who perhaps works in a service where the voice of counseling psychology could be heard more, then this position paper could be really helpful. But also in instances with policymakers and regulatory bodies, when we're thinking about receiving perhaps funding for training in counseling psychology, this position paper could be helpful. And also for just general public and awareness and understanding what it is that we do and the values that we hold. So it starts off by looking at the history of counseling psychology. We initially wanted to take this from a more global perspective, and looking at the rise of humanism and empiricism and having kind of one foot in either place, and how counseling psychology emerged in the tension of this. One of the amazing things about the Global Counselling Psychology Forum, I think, is that we have representatives from all around the globe. And I think a unique factor and really interesting part of this paper is that we do have a brief introduction, or a brief kind of summary around the history of counseling psychology in various nations around the globe. So I think that's really interesting to see all in one place as well. We then went into the philosophy of counseling psychology, and we identified 3 major areas. The first one being the scientist practitioner model, and that balance of the evidence-based practice and that research side of counseling psychology with what it means to be working in the room with the client in our practice. The second area was social justice. This is an area that has a huge historical tie within counseling psychology, but is also one of the main values that we hold as counseling psychologists. And then lastly was the reflective practitioners. So ability to observe our own thought process, feelings and assumptions and biases that might underlie our practice. We then went into the competencies, and I think this is really the meatiest part of the position paper. And I won't go into detail about all the different areas that we cover, but everything from therapy and intervention, research, supervision, diagnostics, service development, all of these different areas that counseling psychologists have competencies in and can really contribute towards. And like I said, this is kind of the meatiest bit of the paper, because a lot of it is designed for people who don't necessarily know exactly what it is that we do. So we wanted to outline that very clearly. So I'll just scroll through that. Then tying together the 3 previous sections, we wanted to take a look at the value of counseling psychologists. We were really purposeful in not wanting to kind of highlight other areas of practitioner psychologists, but instead really focus on what our unique value is. And this draws from our history, the philosophy that we have, and then our competencies as well. And the position paper ends in looking at the sustainability of the profession, which we will be speaking about today as well. But looking to the future of counseling psychology around the globe and what it might hold. Is there provisions for global standards and accreditation, for example? So that is an overview of the position paper. I'm actually just going to end by scrolling right back up to the top where we have this quote, because I think it really helpfully encapsulates counseling psychology. And it says, thus, while the profession has developed alongside other applied fields of psychology, counseling psychology is distinctive from a treatment point of view because of its attention to both normal developmental issues and problems associated with physical, emotional, and mental disorder. So I'll leave it there. I will be putting the link of the position paper in the chat so everyone has access to that. And I'll hand it back to you, Charles. Oh, I think you're on mute, Charles.
Right. Thank you, Chloe. And thank you for all your work on pulling this all together. I think there are all sorts of enormous benefits, but also not least of which is a growing consensus of a global kind of professional identity of counseling psychology. So for those of you who have not seen the document, the link is in the chat. You can download it and and please do share it freely. The idea is to circulate this as widely as we possibly can, and we also welcome people's feedback, questions, and comments. Okay, so it is time to hear from each of the countries. So the idea is that each representative will have about 5 minutes. If you go much over that, I'll draw your attention to it. And I think if each of the presenters could just introduce themselves, obviously say where you're from, and the order in which we're going to do this is to start with Australia. I see Michael is ready. India, Ireland, South Africa, and UK. So Michael, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to you.
Thank you, Charles. You worked on the assumption that I'm ready, but anyway, we'll take it from there. Hi, everyone. As Charles said, my name's Michael. I'm obviously a counselling psychologist. I'm based here in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm the Australian representative on the Global Counselling Psychology Forum. I sit on the APS College of Counselling Psychologists. I've been on the national executive on and off for almost 20 years now. My current role on the executive is to sort of lead the strategy as well as also being the representative. So what I'll attempt to do in 5 minutes is to give you a bit of a sense around the current status of counselling psychology here in Australia, some of the challenges and some of the things that the college is working on about trying to further the profession. So for those of you that aren't familiar with counselling psychology here in Australia, counselling psychology first emerged here in the early 1970s. And prior to 2010, all sort of the registration of psychologists in Australia was handled at a state or territory level. And then in 2010, we had the introduction of a national registration through the Psychology Board of Australia. And what happened as a result of that was that the title counselling psychologist started to become a protected title. So you can only use the title, or can only call yourself a counselling psychologist in the last 14 years if you hold what's called endorsement here in Australia that requires completion of either a master's or a doctoral degree in counselling psychology. So here in Australia, counselling psychology is the second largest area behind clinical psychology. At the moment, we have about 1,050 registered counselling psychologists. But unfortunately, we only have the one current postgraduate training program in the country that enrolls about 12 students a year. So it's an area that we obviously need to expand going forward. What we know for some recent surveys that's been done with counselling psychologists here in Australia is that about 60% of them work primarily in private practice, and about another 40% of counselling psychologists work in private practice as a secondary job. So private practice is the largest settings for typically where you'll find counselling psychologists, and that also brings some challenges with that as well. In terms of the history around how counselling psychology has been taught here and some of the key features in an Australian context is very much around the provision of counselling and psychotherapy. Our counselling psychs here are really trained in a whole range of evidence-based psychotherapies, and really the ability to work across a spectrum from those that present from mild to moderate mental health problems right through to complex, chronic and enduring are really features of counselling psychology here in Australia. And some of the research that's been done in recent years really shows that a lot of our members here, or a lot of counselling psychologists here, do have a real clear sense of the philosophy and values that underpin counselling psychology in Australia. So what are some of the challenges? So as I said before, we only have the one training program in counselling psychology here, and that's been going down gradually from sort of the peak in the early 2000s where we had 7 postgraduate training programs. And unfortunately, that's not just common to counselling psychology. All fields in Australia, aside from clinical psychology, have started to see the reduction in training programs over the last 15 or 20 years. And another big challenge for us is really some inequities that exist in funding schemes. So we have a scheme here in Australia called the Better Access Scheme. That's through a Medicare system where the clients of clinical psychologists are rebated more than seeing clients of other psychologists. So that's created lots of tensions in the workforce and lots of tensions in the field. And whilst we have just over 1,000 counselling psychologists, that number's been fairly constant for the last 5 years. So what we're finding is that we're not actually growing as a profession here in Australia. And also, if you look down from some of the surveys that we've done over recent years, we probably have this, somewhat of an aging population as well, where a lot of the counselling psychologists here are probably closer towards retirement age rather than those coming through in the profession. So it creates a real challenge about how we start to bring the next generation of practitioners through. It's also tensions with scopes of practice as well. When a national registration was introduced in 2010, the Psychology Board of Australia really started to water down the competencies for counselling psychology, particularly in our work with a mental health disorder. So that's been a source of tension. It's something which a college has been trying to advocate for a range of years. And some of the more recent developments is that we are, as a college, we are really trying to address all the inequities that exist in various funding schemes. What we did last year was also we wanted to survey all of our fourth-year psychology students across Australia to get a sense around what their interests and intentions are for further studies. And essentially what we found was that a large proportion of the students would actually study counselling psychology if programs were available. So the college is really thinking now about how we might start to use some of those results and data to advocate with higher education institutions around the possibility of bringing counselling psychology programs back. So I'll pause it there. I hope I kept it under 5 minutes, Charles, but I'll keep my commentary succinct and leave it at that point for now.
Thank you, Michael. You did indeed, and I'm sure there will be many questions. So and there will be an opportunity later on for questions and answers. In the meantime, you can also post questions to the chat, and we'll get to them. So thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for the update from Australia. Ashutosh, are you ready to go for India?
Yeah, why not? Thank you, Charles.
Great, thanks.
A very good afternoon from India. And our situation is also not very different from what is around the globe. In India, counseling psychology as an independent professional identity is not very old. I would say not more than 20 years old. Before that, it was part of the applied psychology programs. Counseling psychology was taught at universities as one of the subjects, one of the papers. But in the last 20 years, it has taken really good shape. And many universities are running master's program with a specialization in counseling psychology, and especially diploma programs in counseling psychology and psychotherapy. So they are very common nowadays, and every year there are new programs coming up in master's and diploma levels. So it is very good from that perspective. But counseling psychology was not regulated. There was no regulator looking after counseling psychologists in India. And even till today, officially, there is one agency, National Commission for Allied Healthcare Commission, which is likely to register counseling psychologists, but they are yet to start it. So counseling psychology in India is still an unregulated branch of study. And in numbers, we are the largest practicing group of psychologists across all. I believe we are 3 to 4 times more than clinical psychologist practitioners in private practice. Most of counseling psychologists are having their independent practice. Some of them are also recruited by hospitals and universities and colleges with recent changes. And in 2017, when we started the assertion of identity as counseling psychology as an independent profession and independent identity, a lot of people have started identifying. But as there is no regulator, there is no standard qualification for counseling psychologists. But as association, we asserted that one should be masters at least, with the preference of having diploma or PhD or some years of experience in counseling and psychotherapy. And there are a couple of recent nuances being created by the regulators, and we are fighting for that. One of such is that BSc Counseling Psychology, BSc Clinical Psychology program has been introduced by the clinical psychology regulators, and they intend to call these BSc graduates counseling psychologists. So we are fighting for that, and we are hoping that we will be able to manage it well very soon. So thank you very much. This is a brief from India.
Thank you, Ashutosh. That's well timed, and thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions about counseling psychology in India, there'll be an opportunity shortly. So next up is Ireland. Tim.
Hi, good morning, everyone from Dublin, Ireland here. My name is Tim. I'm chairperson of the division here in Ireland. So our division in the Psychological Society in Ireland would be one of the largest ones as well. I think at the moment we're maybe second place or third place in terms of largest volume, together with clinical and educational psychology divisions. We have about 250 members. Now that's also in the context that Ireland has about 5 to 6 million people living in it, right? So in terms of size of the country, it's maybe quite different than some of the other countries. And because in Ireland currently, the term psychologist or counselling psychologist is not legally regulated just yet. So not everyone is registered with the organization that I'm presenting, for example. So this is a big milestone. So I'll touch briefly on some of the history. So in the late 1990s, or 1980s, I always forget how to say that, 1989 anyway, there was a one-year master's in counselling psychology. A handful of years later, that turned into a 2-year master's, and somewhere around 2011 or 12, this transitioned into a 3-year doctorate. At some point, there was another course, another master's in counselling psychology down the country. I don't quite know the story behind that, but that course no longer exists. So currently in Ireland, there's one route to become a counselling psychologist. That is the doctorate that is here established, or foreign qualifications also matter. Counselling psychologists here, many work privately and also publicly, are also employed by the Public Health Service. The program that is here has been fighting for a very long time together with the psychology body to get more equity. So over the years, for example, health insurances for those in private practice like myself would reimburse counselling psychologists. Currently, they reimburse equally. That wasn't always the case. There is one insurance that I know of that discriminates, but they discriminate between psychotherapists and psychologists, actually, not between psychologists itself. So interesting. So that's part of it. Another big move that has been happening here is that only since last September, the doctorate here has gotten its first round of funding. So the students here, for the first time in history, counselling psychology received some funding. So not everyone is funded on the program, and no one is funded 100%. There's a sort of measurement done, which is relatively equal to how the clinical psychology program here is funded. So myself and everyone before last September would have self-funded counselling psychology in a way that brought a huge diversity, but lots of EU, but also lots of non-EU students that would join every year, although they would pay different tuitions and everyone was self-funded, right? So there's cultural diversity coming into it, but arguably, you know, socioeconomic status diversity was lacking because it was a self-funded degree and quite pricey. So the funding is growing and is being fine-tuned as we speak. It's not fully equal yet, so that's something that needs to be managed. Another big move that's happening in Ireland is that the current proposal is that as of late next year, the profession of psychology, including the title of counselling psychology, would be legally regulated. So this is going to be a huge shift in terms of, you know, the body that I'm representing is going to be much more purely professional development focused and society and community focused, and no longer has to regulate the titles, for example. That's going to be done with a legal statutory body, which is going to be a really welcome change because currently it's really hard to regulate, as we, you know, most of us know in many countries where it's not legally protected as well. So that's a little bit on the history in Ireland and current developments that are happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you very much. Good to hear from Ireland. And Mike Weber from South Africa in Cape Town.
Good
There you
morning,
go.
folks. Yes, greetings from wet and windy southern tip of Africa. Yeah, here in South Africa, if I can just provide some context, South Africa, psychology is a regulated and protected profession. The title is protected, and the conduct, the professional conduct, the kind of things that psychologists can do is protected in law, meaning that people who are not registered as psychologists should not be carrying out. However, having the statutory rights and this protection in law doesn't mean to say it's always applied. And we do have a thriving market of charlatans and quacks calling themselves coaches, counselors, therapists, and whatever around the fringes of the health profession who are not regulated and are a danger. But unfortunately, our regulatory body and law enforcement agencies have been somewhat reluctant to take up the cudgels in stamping those out. So we are required to register with our regulatory body, the Health Professions Council of South Africa, who has a professional board for psychology as part of it. People are required to obtain a master's degree in psychology and a one-year internship, and then write a national board exam before being able to register as a psychologist. Currently in South Africa, we've got a number of registration categories, which is clinical, counseling, educational, industrial organization, research, and neuropsychology. So those are our current registration categories. So we are a protected profession, so we have that benefit. In some ways, hearing of experiences around the world, we feel quite kind of privileged that we have that legal protection at the moment. However, there are medical insurers that do discriminate against counseling psychologists. Clinical psychology is privileged, and from a funding perspective, the insurers, medical insurers, sometimes maintain that counseling psychologists do not diagnose any form of psychopathology, and we do not treat it either. We only work with the worried well. On the employment front, the majority of counseling psychologists in South Africa are self-employed. They're in private practice because the state, more than 95% of the posts are reserved for clinical psychologists. So nearly all the posts in the Department of Health, our state healthcare sector, are only open for clinical psychologists, and the only bodies that employ counseling psychologists are the likes of our prison service, the Department of Correctional Services, our military medical services, and the Department of Education. So as a result, the vast majority of counseling psychologists work for themselves. We as a psychology association here, Counselling Psychology South Africa, was actually established, and I see one of our founding members, Elaine Bing, is online with us here today. And it was developed to protect counseling psychology, to actually lobby and advocate for the rights of counseling psychology and the services we provide. And we've made some headway in that regard. We have certain statutory guidelines in terms of a regulation called the Prescribed Minimum Benefits Act that insurers have to cover. And we, so far, through a good working relationship with our colleagues in the Clinical Psychology Forum and the South African Society of Psychiatrists, we have been included in those treatment algorithms. We are recognized for the treatment of psychopathology in hospitals, in the private sector. Unfortunately, our regulatory body has also been trying to distinguish hard boundaries between clinical counseling and educational psychology, and they have compelled universities that previously ran clinical and counseling psychology programs in parallel, attending the same lectures, the same courses, the same trainings, and they've required that these programs be separated. And some of the local universities here in Cape Town have looked at the cost implications and said they're not able to fund two separate programs. And it almost goes without saying that the counseling program will be dropped. And that's exactly what's happened. We don't have a single university in Cape Town offering counseling psychology master's degrees. There are fortunately still 7 others around South Africa that do that. Funding is an issue because locally, clinical psychologists do qualify for bursaries and scholarships from the government to fund their employment. Their internships are paid for by the Department of Health, whereas counseling psychologists have to pay their own university fees. They frequently have to do unpaid internships for 12 months, and even worse, sometimes have to pay for their own supervision through those 12 months of internship. So it's a fairly costly exercise to get into counseling psychology in South Africa. I think this document, the position paper, is going to be something great. We really will be able to use this to lobby for our position as counseling psychologists in South Africa, because not only is it our opinion, it carries the weight of counseling psychology around the world. So I think I'll just leave it at that there. We can certainly revisit this if there are other questions around the chat and talk more at length about the challenges we face in South Africa. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks very much, Mike, for your overview. There's some interesting themes coming up. I'm sure that we'll touch on when we get to the panel discussion. And And then lastly, but certainly not least, Sue is going to give us an update. Counselling Psychology in the United Kingdom, Sue Whitcombe.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Yeah, I'm Sue. I'm the current chair of the Division of Counselling Psychology, which sits within the British Psychological Society. That is our sort of professional body. Certainly not all counselling psychologists belong to the division, but we have a significant number of our colleagues are registered with us. We are regulated in the UK by the Health and Care Professions Council, which regulates all practitioner psychologists, all applied psychologists. The title psychologist itself is not regulated in the UK, but the specific titles of clinical psychologist, counselling psychologist, educational psychologist, along with a few others, are regulated. And there are nearly 28,000 practitioner psychologists here in the UK, of which counselling psychologists are about 3,300. Now, we're the third largest domain of applied psychology in the UK, slightly behind educational psychologists. Our membership in the Division of Counselling Psychology is quite a diverse membership. We're quite diverse in terms of age. We have quite a normal distribution in the age profile, with the majority of our members being in the 40 to 45 age group. And we're very diverse in terms of ethnicity. Counselling psychology in the UK has had a gradual increase since the late 1980s, when we had about 1,000 counselling psychologists in the UK. Our current membership is levelling off around the 4,000 mark, the majority of those being qualified counselling psychologists, though we do have significant number of trainees who register with us. It's usually a requirement of their training that they register with the professional body. And we have a lot of people who are interested in becoming counselling psychologists who are registered with us as well. We don't actually know very well where our membership actually works. We know that a lot of our members are in private practice, some work in charities and not-for-profits, some work in the NHS, working with mental health, physical health, in primary care or community services. We have some working in forensic services, in education and social care. The NHS in England, that's our public sector, our health body, don't actually know how many counselling psychologists are working with them either. And their data is sort of somewhat out of date. A lot of our counselling psychologist colleagues are recorded as clinical psychologists or psychotherapists within our NHS. So we're doing some work to try and have more accurate recording of where our members work and where counselling psychologists work. We've just had the data in from our 2024 member survey, which is going to be really, really helpful in this. And we can see already from that 50% of our membership at least spend some of their time working in the public sector. So there is some work to do on that. In terms of employment, we have excellent competencies, excellent therapeutic and relational skills, and we're creative and adaptable. And this is really helpful for our members and our colleagues in gaining employment in all of those sectors that we've mentioned. There's an increase in demand in the psychological workforce, and there's significant focus on increasing psychological professions at the moment, and increased growth in the awareness of mental health and the role of psychology and well-being. So that brings us opportunities outside traditional employment sectors as well. But we have significant challenges. There's an increase in new NHS roles within the public sector, very specific roles for specific disorders, if you like, or specific services, whether that's inpatient services with severe and complex mental health, or whether it's specifically on primary care mental health with moderate depression, that sort of thing, which is sort of pushing out some of the opportunities for counselling psychology initially. We have a significant challenge of getting seats at the table in discussions for policy making, commissioning and service development. We know from our member survey that we have a significant number of counselling psychologists who are in senior roles, but it doesn't seem at the moment that they are taking up those positions that are necessary to get the voice of counselling psychology mentioned. There are also still some issues around recruitment practices, though the BPS has worked particularly hard to address this. We have guidance on recruiting according to competence rather than adjectival title. And we do, as a professional body, challenge when we see employment opportunities signposted just for clinical psychology. We will challenge those opportunities, challenge those advertisements as well. Our training in the UK is done mainly at university. There are 11 doctoral training courses in the UK and an independent route run by the BPS. All of the training in the UK is currently accredited by the BPS as well as approved by the Health and Care Professions Council. And the BPS standards in education and training are regularly reviewed and updated. We do have some concerns around the sustainability of doctoral training programmes. There have been some recent course closures, and there's a current pause on the independent route run by the BPS. And of course, our biggest challenge is the inequity in funding for trainees. All clinical psychologists are employed by our public sector from the date they start their training for 3 years. All their fees are paid, all the courses are funded, whereas counselling psychologists have to fund their own training. There's also some issues with us as a professional body. How well do colleagues value the BPS compared to how they value our particular division? And we need to be doing some work along that in sustaining our member engagement and whether we continue to be able to represent our members well enough, supported by the overarching BPS. I think I'll leave that there, but I hope that was okay.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. And well done to all of the local country presenters. You're stuck well in your time, which actually gives us a little bit more time in the next, I hope you can still see my PowerPoint, in the next stage, which is the panel discussions. And so the idea here is each of the country representatives now will form a panel and we'll put some questions to them, and then later we'll open it up for a Q&A from anybody who has a question. A couple of things stood out for me that I thought were interesting. Some of the sort of commonalities around the globe are that counselling psychology is often one of the bigger specialties in applied psychology, second or third to clinical psychology. Yet in most of the countries we've heard from, there are these inequities, these injustices, these sort of struggles that the profession or individuals within the profession encounter. And I suppose the question I have for the panel, and I don't mind who wants to take it up, and is really around sustainability, how we sort of move beyond some of these challenges, how we make counselling psychology more visible and able to take its rightful place. And if anybody wants to come in.
Maybe I'll jump in, Charles, there. We've done a lot of work on this in the UK, an awful lot of work, but it often comes down to a few really dedicated colleagues who really want to push this forward. I think we're all quick here to grasp the benefits of moving towards equality, but not everybody is prepared to put in what is needed. So we've had significant lobbying of our commissioning services and our employers to draw their attention to the fact that we are equally competent to, particularly clinical psychologists, in carrying out the work that needs to be done within our public sector health service. We are continually lobbying where we notice discrimination in terms of policy development. So this week we were looking at clinical neuropsychology in the UK, and I noticed there were a lot of references just to clinical psychologists. But counselling psychologists can also be neuropsychologists in the UK. We've had issues around perinatal mental health, where it just references clinical psychology, and again, it's going back and challenging. So it's being alert, or our members alerting us to all the areas where there is continued discrimination, and us being prepared and able to challenge those. We have significant support from the overarching BPS on doing that, or we have done up to date. But it is somewhat tiresome, but necessary that we keep challenging that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Mike, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Yeah, just to echo what Sue was saying there, coming at it from a different angle. As counselling psychologists, we need to blow our trumpet. We need to get out there and actually advocate and lobby and announce what we are, what we do. We're not wellness counsellors. We're not personal coaches, that we are real psychologists. And I think we need to kind of mobilize. One of the difficulties we have, especially in South Africa, there does seem to be a great degree of apathy amongst the counselling psychology community. So these initiatives are driven by a handful of people. There's a small number of people who advocate, who lobby, who speak out. And we need to kind of mobilize. And that's where the white paper or the position paper comes in, that we can actually use this for our benefit. We can use it to our advantage to actually get out there and say what counselling psychology is actually about. One of the things that came up in last week's webinar, which resonated, is that clinical psychologists seem to have an identity crisis. They really want to be counselling psychologists. So the majority of clinical psychologists that I know in private practice are actually practicing as counselling psychologists. They just don't want to be called that because of the discrimination by the funders and the financial implications of wanting to be a counselling psychologist. But what they're doing is, in essence, is counselling psychology, the philosophical framework, the underpinnings, the phenomenological approach, the person-centered approach, bringing yourself into therapy. They're not what clinical psychology used to be. And so they kind of have an identity crisis. And I think this is something we need to point out. And I'm certainly going to be using that in correspondence I'm going to send to the professional board in the next few weeks regarding the transversal registration thing. And so kind of that's another thing that we're facing in South Africa. Our regulatory board has allowed people to transversely re-register, although it's an extremely onerous and almost impossible process to achieve, because they expect that counselling psychologists who wish to re-register as clinicals need to do a one-year internship to achieve that. But yeah, I do think that we need to advocate. In South Africa, we're shortly going to embark on a marketing drive to just try and attract more participation, to get more counselling psychologists interested and get them participating, just to try and mobilize them. So yeah, apathy seems to be a bit of a headache for us.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else want to come in?
Yeah, Charles, if I could just add a few words. I think something that Sue said that really resonated with me about the importance of having a seat at the table. I think, at least here in Australian context, often counselling psychologists haven't had that seat at the table. So we're not the people that are consulting up to government about how funding schemes or initiatives should actually look. And I think as a field, we need to get much better at getting really politically savvy and getting involved in those committees where we can have the ear of government and can actually tell them, you know, what we do and what we offer. And I think another challenge is that it's often hard to get counselling psychologists motivated to do that work, because often I know here in Australia, people just want to do their jobs, see their clients and actually focus on the stuff that they want to do as opposed to being in that role. That's why you have people like myself that have been around the profession for 20 years and still can't leave, unfortunately. So, you know, like we need that next generation of people that want to take in those roles and come in and really have the passion and energy to advocate and take up the fight to government and other people about who counselling psychologists are and what we do.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. So then, what do you perceive to be the opportunities for counselling psychology in your different countries? What is the sort of unique contribution that counselling psychology can make? I suppose related to that, why ought universities not cut counselling psychology programs? I don't know if anybody would like to chip in. We haven't heard from, I don't know, anyone we haven't heard from? Or Anyone we have? Talk a bit about what it is. Good to hear
Chair,
what.
if
Yeah.
please allow me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Ashutosh.
yeah, counseling is actually more generic than clinical psychologist. If I say that if we look at the population in general, if we look at Indian estimate, every fifth Indian is in need of psychological support. But not all of them require clinical intervention. Not all of them are having any kind of disease or psychopathology for that matter. They are struggling with their day-to-day challenges. They are struggling with their marriages. They are struggling at their workplaces. They are struggling with themselves, with their self-esteem issues, and a lot of psychological issues where they need psychological support. And only we are the people who are trained and equipped and competent enough to intervene there. Though there is a lot of overlap between clinical and counseling psychology with reference to mild to moderate nature of pathology, we both work on these clients who have mild depression or mild anxiety, acute anxiety kind of thing. But majority of people who come for psychological support or who need psychological support are not having psychopathology for that matter. And we are the people who actually go and intervene there. That is the reason if we take an estimate of people who are offering non-clinical services or who are counseling psychologists, or at some places they call themselves therapists, or some places even non-psychology people who call themselves healers and all those sub-professional kind of people, they are serving to peoples in billions. And actually they are our clients. We are skilled and competent enough to serve them. And in India, I believe that is the reason why counseling psychology is becoming so popular. And everybody wants to enter into the domain of counseling psychology. The only challenge we have is that we don't have a regulator who can standardize the training and qualification of the counselors. Otherwise, we are more equipped, more competent, and have bigger market. And what Devar was saying was very, very appropriate, that clinical psychologists want to enter, or actually are into our domains, because most of the work they do is actually counseling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was involved in training clinical and counseling psychologists in South Africa for years, and often people would say the problem is counseling psychology scope of practice is limited. The reality was that counseling psychology has a very broad scope of practice. And in fact, in South Africa, we don't like to, we don't need to reference clinical psychology. We're a profession that stands on its own. But in South Africa, at least, clinical psychologists get most of their training exposure in psychiatric hospitals with very kind of severely troubled people. And that, in my view, is not quite the same foundation and not as valuable foundation as counseling psychologists have. I see there are a couple of hands that are up, and let's take a few more comments. Also interested to hear things that are going well. I'll come to that in a minute. Tim, I see your hand is up, and then Mike.
Hi. So in terms of one of the things that I think that makes us stand out and particularly unique, although I hope we don't remain unique in this, because I think the more the better, is the social justice piece that I think is so core and fundamental to what we do. And with everything happening in the world, and that is usually happening in the world, I see in my own experience here in Ireland, a lot of the folk that are psychologists and that are actively standing up for these inequalities, but not exclusively, but a lot of them are counselling psychologists. Some of the groups that I would be involved in would be about, 3/4 would be counselling psychologists, and the others would be non-counselling psychologists, for example. Yeah. So actually in this space of voicing the inequalities for others, we're somehow particularly good or skilled or vocal, but when it maybe comes to our own inequality and our own lived experience of our lack of funding or something, we sometimes maybe are a bit too quiet. And I think certainly in the history of counselling psychology here in Ireland, there is there's a growing trend of counselling psychologists working really, really hard to catch up and to get really senior positions. And really, in the public sector, it's really only in the last couple of years that a counselling psychologist got a really senior position for the first time, right? So we're catching up in that way. We're certainly not there yet. But yeah, social justice is really the one that came to mind when you asked that.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thanks, Tim. Mike?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, just to mirror and echo what you were saying there, and Tim, that yes, we are probably better positioned from a social justice or equity point of view to address some of these the challenges. But I speak from an implicit and explicit biased point of view that I think counselling psychology is a better form of psychology, and the way to sell it to the training organizations is that counselling psychology has the potential to develop better outcomes. We get better outcomes because we don't only adopt a minimalist or reductionist medical model trained in medical hospitals and the like. We take people's biopsychosocial circumstances into account. So yes, there's a biology, but we also look at their psychological and their social functioning and how those have an impact on their mental health. And we work at those multiple levels. We don't only work within the medical context. We don't buy into the fallacy that depression is a serotonin imbalance in the brain, which is an absurd stance. We recognize the person's global functioning, a phenomenological approach. And in that regard, I think we have the potential to better serve the mental health needs of a population than our clinical psychologists could, because I think their training, as you mentioned, is reductionist, whereas we are trained in a broader context. So I think that's where we need to sell counselling psychology, that without, for lack of a better word, it's a better psychology.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, well said. Last question, and then let's open it up to others. But we've heard of a couple of successes. Tim and Ireland, sounds like there's progress around funded training. Mike, you mentioned some progress in terms of the Clinical Psychology Association in South Africa and psychiatrists and being sort of formally recognized, which I recall wasn't the case. Are there any other recent or imminent success stories that people would be in a position to share? Sue?
I think one of the big ones for us is the recognition that for our colleagues who wish to go into clinical neuropsychology is that they can, and there are now training pathways available for them to do that, and they are treated as equivalent. And our division is actually funding, offering bursaries to some people to help them support with their neuropsychology training. We have seen increases in some paid training internships for some of our members. It's still small, and they're small pockets, but what we're trying to do is harness that good practice, write it up and share it more widely to show how this can be done, I think. So that's really important for us to recognize that is happening. I think one of our big benefits we have over here is there are some really good flexible training routes. So some of the institutions who offer those doctoral programs are aware of the pressures and strains on trainees in terms of funding and in terms of work-life balance, and maybe having to keep working while they're actually training. So we have had an increase in part-time training options, or options that are focused on training at weekends rather than throughout the week, although acknowledging you need to do your internship and your placements, your clinical work during the week. So I think that's really a really good way of addressing some of the issues that we have.
Yeah, sounds great. Sounds very good to hear. Well done. Any others?
Another one that came to mind for me, I know you mentioned a couple of how Ireland is really, I think positively so, really catching up and really doing some really great work. Just one more that I wanted to acknowledge in there, with the legal regulation of psychology coming in, I think a really big win is that the proposed model, and finger crossed nothing is super set in stone, but this is hopefully going to happen. I won't bore you with the details, but there's two proposed things that are going to happen. One is the regulation of the the title of psychologist. This is going to happen long term, not next year. And the thing that's going to start next year is the regulation of counselling psychologist, educational psychologist, and clinical psychologist, those three professions. So I just wanted to acknowledge, I think that's a really big win, that we're coming far enough to make sure that when the legal regulation is happening in this country, that counselling psychology is one of the three clinical specialisms that gets the equality treatment in there.
Yeah, that's excellent. Good to hear. Well done. So I'm sure there are people with lots of questions or comments. So let's open it up to everybody. If you like, you can post your questions in the chat and I'll keep an eye on that. Otherwise, you know how to do it. Just put your hand up and feel free to come in with a question to the panel or a comment or a suggestion or anything you like. Who's going to kick us off? I'm not a psychodynamic psychotherapist, so I don't sit very comfortably with these silences.
Just a comment. I think there are a lot of startups who have started working and who have started hiring a lot of counseling psychologists and who are working on implementing counseling psychology in different products. I think that's a big achievement.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, Charles. It's Katrina.
Ah, good to see you again, Katrina. It's been a while.
Absolutely. Good to see you, and hello, everybody. I am curious to find out whether this forum had some thoughts about where you might go next, if there's some things on the horizon now that the paper is out and being circulated. And thank you very much, by the way, just for everybody's hard work.
Right. Well, Yatunda, you're going to be the best person to answer that.
You're in as good a position as me to answer that question. Where do we go next? I think we have some ideas about running conferences, making sure that the position paper continues to evolve. If you like, ideally, what we would like is to make the position a legal paper, so that in any of country where counseling psychology is being looked at, there is something that can be a strong supporter of advocating for counseling psychology. One thing I picked up on during the conversation has been around sort of, I think somebody said, we can just be counseling psychologists, and I agree with that. Perhaps the position paper allows us to continue to build on those strengths and increase the visibility, so that we're not left feeling like we're having to defend the profession and can actually focus on the counseling psychology practice. As we continue to see, the only difference, certainly in my mind, between any applied psychology would be the ethos and the philosophical stance. And quite a lot of other applied psychologists are borrowing, shall we say, the humanistic values that we hold true to the profession. So the short answer is we've got some ideas, but we need to continue to build on the position paper, because we certainly don't cover the whole globe. So it would be great to have more countries join us and align with what the Global Counselling Psychology Forum stands for. And Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I agree. Mike?
Thanks, Joel. Just to follow on what Yatunda was saying there too about attracting more interest from other psychology associations around the world. That's going to be kind of the ongoing project, because one of the great like advantages we've derived from the process so far already is just the ongoing dialogue. It's the conversation. It's counseling psychologists around the world engaging with each other, learning from each other. I was really impressed at the American Psychological Association Congress a few weeks ago, which was a hybrid in-person and online conference. The closing address at the APA Congress was 4 female of color psychologists having a panel discussion on the stage, and all 4 of them were counseling psychologists, not a clinical psychologist in sight. And I thought that was wonderful. What an amazing thing. There were 8,914 psychologists at the conference, online and in person. But it was amazing to see 4 counseling psychologists, and we really can learn from each other, especially people like the APA. Bonjour in the United States, he's with I think it's Division 17 of the APA, the counseling division. And we certainly want to find out and explore, how did they reach that kind of prominence? How did they reach that, and what can we learn from this? I think the ongoing dialogue is in and of itself one of the primary functions of this forum, and that we need to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for those of you who don't know, the forum meets monthly, and I've also always enjoyed the conversations. It's nice to hear about what's happening in other countries, and also to hear about how counseling psychologists in other countries have overcome some of the challenges that I think we recognize almost globally. Any other questions? Comments?
Can I come back in for a second? I think
please.
For me, certainly looking at the position paper and looking at the contributions from colleagues from around the globe, I think one thing that we have talked about and might be something that we develop further, that's something for the group to pick up on, is around training. One thing that strikes me with certainly our clinical psychology colleagues is that for the majority, the training is identical. And one of the beauties of counseling psychology is that we have that flexibility. So, some people tend to focus on, psychodynamics, some people very CBT, some people very existential, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I also wonder, though, if, around the visibility and the promotion of those modalities that we practice and the benefits, and ensuring that the trainings that we have are equitable, is that the right word to use? Utilize, but also mindful of the traditions of each locality, because what we don't want to do is to have to promote a very rigid pathway to becoming a counseling psychologist. Similarly, or equally, we need to ensure that our training standards and our training provisions meet the needs of the communities that we serve, and that sometimes perhaps is a little bit lacking on our part, and so we need to come together in a way that we can pull together training standards, which we've tried to do somewhat within the position paper as well.
I think that's we do, and I think it would be very interesting to start looking at in more detail how training occurs in the different countries. Sue.
Hi, Charles. Just with Yetunde mentioning that here, and I can imagine what a challenge that would be on a global basis, because it's a continual challenge just in the UK. In terms of, I sat as chair of the training committee in counselling psychology, which sets the standards of education and training for our doctoral programs. And there is always a tension there about how much we should proscribe, how much should be in there, and how much freedom each the institution should have, and how they do their training, or what modalities that they practice. And that is the constant tension. How we ensure that our competencies are maintained and sustained, so that we can meet the needs of the population, and we can meet the needs of the commissioning services here, but also that allows us the flexibility to be the counselling psychologist we want to be, if you like, you know, to ensure that we're enabled to do that. So it's a tension within our own country. So I can imagine that would be quite a tension globally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always struck me that counselling psychology's training is a little bit more flexible, whereas clinical psychology, particularly in the UK, very much governed by NHS needs, cognitive behavioral. But maybe as a way of, I mean, I agree, very difficult to look at how training happens, but maybe looking at mapping competencies across countries be an interesting start. Any other comments, questions? There's an appreciative comment on the position paper. Thank you.
Is it okay for me to ask it
Please.
Ourselves the question? One thing that seems to have been talked about earlier was sort of this or limited engagement of counselling psychology, and I don't profess to know what's happening around the world, but I guess I was a little bit curious as to what others in different localities, you know, what are your thoughts around why counselling psychologists don't often come up and get involved? In my experience, sometimes there's a lack of engagement, but that, you know, I don't think engagement should be focused on just being in senior positions alone. You don't have to be a senior counselling psychologist to participate in the conversation or to get involved with what counselling psychology stands for. So I'm curious to hear what people think about this lack of engagement, or whether it is a lack. Is there a lack of engagement, or is that just my sort of bias, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I'm also curious to hear it. Certainly in South Africa, it seemed organized counselling psychology emerged out of an injustice, which was a 2011 regulation. But up until that point in South Africa, clinical psychology had always dominated the professional board, were organized, they had societies, they promoted themselves. And it just seemed that counselling psychology were more focused on getting on with doing their day-to-day jobs. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that from other countries. Mike, you had your hand up. Sue, I see you've raised your hand.
Perhaps we can just come back. What I wanted to bring up wasn't related to this particular discussion thread, so I'll perhaps come back to it just now.
Okay. I'll come back to you, Sue.
Yeah, I've been having some conversations with people who have left the professional body, who have, and they've some quite senior people, and that's been quite interesting in itself. I wonder a little bit if some of them lose their identity as a counselling psychologist the further they move up the progression. I wonder they've just become a psychologist in a senior strategic role and almost forget where they came from a little bit and don't advocate for profession. But there's also another part of that some of them don't lose that identity, and they feel that their identity is particularly important. But some of our members or ex-members are really struggling at the moment with what benefits the wider British Psychological Society has for them. And because they don't need to belong to that, because we are regulated by the Health and Care Professions Council, they are choosing to have their membership lapse, and we're losing their voice then within us representing counselling psychology. So I think we've got a significant piece of work to do there about trying to retain those people within the profession, because there are some really good advocates for the profession, and some of them have significant positions, and they do have seats at the table. So we need to retain them and harness their voices, really. So that's a bit of work that we need to be doing.
Yeah. I think it's a good point. I worked in the NHS where I was the only counselling psychologist and surrounded by at least a dozen clinical psychologists, and it is hard to hold on to your roots in isolation. So yeah, I think that's valid.
Charles, I'm just going to add, I think this situation in Australia is very similar to what you described in South Africa, where we end up with a lot of clinical psychologists who are really organised about getting onto committees or getting onto professional registration bodies, and a lot of counselling psychologists just want to work. I think where it's even more complicated is that because we've had only the one program really operating for the last 10 years, is that we don't have those students who are often really engaged in their profession, really interested in really starting to, think about a career in counselling psychology and getting involved. We don't have that throughput of people that then want to join committees and have the energy to be involved. So it's sort of left to people that have done that job for many years that are sort of thinking, do I still have the energy for this? Do I still want to invest in this? It might be towards the later stages of their career. So I think we really need, in Australia at least, more training programs, because that'll start to increase our presence and start to get a lot more energy about getting involved in the
field. Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie.
Hiya. Yeah, just to follow on from that, I'm really lucky. I suppose I'm 24 years in the one job in the National Counselling Service. So I graduated 25 years ago with the Masters in Counselling Psychology from Trinity in Dublin. And I've only been able to supervise one student in all my career. And there was the program, Tim was saying, there was a program in Cork City, but now there's only the one in Dublin. And it's interesting, like in the Midlands in Ireland, it's only an hour and a half from Dublin, but often it's like we're a million miles away. So it's really, there are a number of counselling psychologists employed in our national service, but we don't sit around at all and talk about being counselling psychology and our psychologists, and our job title is counsellor stroke therapist, not even counsellor stroke psychotherapist. The name of the service is National Counselling Service. So it's nearly, that's why I'm joining this meeting. I think this is my second one, just to actually try and connect back into my roots. But yeah, I'd say I am a bit complacent. And I suppose, without that student, I really like what that previous speaker said, that without the student input, that probably does contribute to my kind of, I'm comfortable, I'm okay. There's other people more agitated about it. So I suppose I'm just trying to say I appreciate the work, but I can really own that, I'm not part of that battle. And I suppose I'm not looking to change jobs, but I imagine that's where it can happen too, if you're trying to get in and you can't get in if the doors are closed. Yeah.
Yeah, interacting with new people in the profession is, of course, a privilege. One thought I did have was I have a student who's just finished her PhD looking at the early career experiences of counselling psychologists. And what struck me about all of this was how difficult it is for counselling psychologists in early career stages, particularly in places like South Africa, where private practice is the primary employment route. And it's not like in Australia where you just simply join an existing private practice. People go and set that up on their own. So whilst recently qualified counselling psychologists have a much, I think, clearer professional identity than I did when I trained as a counselling psychologist, also 25 years ago. But they're so burdened by the demands of trying to kind of negotiate employment and work and pay off their student debts that they just don't have time to become involved and advocate for the profession. So maybe there's more we can do to support newly qualified counselling psychologists. Any other points? Or Mike, do you want to switch to the point you were going to make earlier?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, there's kind of a topic that seems to be trending in the US at the moment. 4 of the papers at the APA Congress were around the ethics of AI and the use of AI. And I think it's something, whether we like it or not, we are going to have to confront and deal with at some point. And as counseling psychologists, I think we have a unique role in doing that, because the AI models, and there's some brilliant work being done there. One of the presenters there was a psychologist who works at Stanford University developing AI models for use in mental health. So they've got some real rocket scientists working in Silicon Valley on these matters. But one of the presenters was very firm. We are psychologists. We provide the treatment. AI will not. And we need to fill that space. And they were saying that AI is coming whether we like it or not, but it's perhaps in the medical reductionist model, it would be more kind of usable, that large language models will probably find their place in the psychiatric profession and the mental health hospitals. But as counseling psychologists, we still have that human touch. We still believe that we are psychologists, we provide the service, and it's just a matter of how we harness AI or use it to our benefit, because it certainly does have benefits. The guy from Stanford University was quite adamant that we can use it to automate certain processes. We can use it to our benefit as an assistant, to do some of the boring admin stuff we don't really like doing. We can use it as a collaborator, and he had some interesting ideas on how we could make AI a co-therapist and use it to improve our therapeutic skills. And then the last and least favorable option was the AI as the therapist. And I think perhaps it's something that going forward globally in counseling psychology is going to have to engage with. I don't particularly like the idea. I like things just as they are. I like status quo. I don't like change. But yeah, unfortunately, the pace of change and technological revolution is going to overwhelm us. And it's something that counseling psychology needs to fill the space. We need to speak out. We need to be emphatic. We are psychologists. We lead that process. We're not going to let the funders or governments drive that process. We should.
Yeah. And good opportunity maybe to emphasize that, we're not all just about techniques and doing unto clients, but it's a relational process that first and foremost for counseling psychologists. Any other questions or comments? It looks like maybe we are nearing the end. In which case, unless there's a burning question, I'm teaching at the moment, so I end my lectures with any questions and silence, and then I pack up and I get to the door, and everybody has their door questions, a bit like clients. In that case, if there are no more questions, it's been wonderful to be here. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and thank you very much to Michael, Ashutosh, who had to leave, to Tim, to Mike, to Sue, who gave input for each of their countries, and to thanks again to Chloe, who presented the position paper. If you haven't seen the position paper yet or haven't had an opportunity to read it, the link has been posted a couple of times. Please do circulate that. I think many years ago, it struck me when I started supervising intern counseling psychologists, and I'd ask them, so what are you? How do you describe yourself to people? And they always started with, we're like clinical psychologists, but we're a little bit different in this way and that way. So it's wonderful to have a sort of global kind of consensus on what we are, and very important, I think, for all of us to describe ourselves without having to reference our colleagues in clinical psychology or anywhere else, just as they have no need necessarily to reference us when they explain what a clinical psychologist is. So please share that widely as you can. Send it off on your email lists, give it to your colleagues, your students, your supervisees. And if you've got any comments or questions, do send them to the, and we will happily enjoy them. I think there was a email address, but I can't find it right now. So thank you, everyone. It's been great to be here. Hope you have a good day, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and we'll be in touch again soon. Please do look out for future webinars, and this will be recorded, and I think that recording will be available. But thanks for coming, and look forward to chatting again soon. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey, everyone.